This video is going to give an overview of some of the branches of epidemiology. So the first one I'm going to start with is just the study of causal inference, which is a special methodological branch of epidemiology, and it's basically just exploring the theory of causation in observational epidemiology. So there's this thing called the counterfactual conundrum. I'm not sure if that's like a commonly coined phrase, but it's just a conundrum to do with the counterfactual state. So it's the idea that if we know an individual has the disease and we know their exposure status, ideally to have the perfect evidence that the exposure caused the disease, we'd be able to go back in time and change their exposure status and see if their disease status changes, basically. That's impossible, so the best we can do is make the exposed and unexposed group as similar as possible to if we were to be able to go back in time and change someone's exposure status. And randomization does that pretty well, but it gets even harder with observational because people are self-assigning. So the possibility of being representative of the counterfactual state becomes harder and harder, and basically causal inference in epidemiology is all about trying to overcome that. It's very methodologically focused. Environmental epidemiology focuses on environmental exposures and human health, so stuff that you're encountering in the environment. The basics are usually air pollution and water contamination, and these factors can be biotic, such as just various toxins that are like organic in nature. It can also be abiotic, so chemicals and pollution being emitted by like industrial processes. Occupational epidemiology is all about the health of workers, and that's a really important one as far as doing cohort studies in order to make sure that workers aren't being exposed to negative things. Throughout the Industrial Revolution is when it started to become clear that people are willing to expose themselves to some pretty dangerous things just to make a living, and basically occupational epidemiology is all about understanding those various exposures, and it can be really helpful in identifying basically like atrocities in what people are willing to expose their workers to, and it can help improve workplace conditions. It's usually a consequence of workplace exposures, and some examples are like having a noisy workplace and hearing loss, radiation and cancer, or being exposed to toxic fumes and substances, like if you're part of like some manufacturing process that produces noxious substances, and that can cause disease or various problems like infertility. Molecular epidemiology deals with risk factors on a molecular level. It's pretty self-explanatory. There's two major things you'd be dealing with. So like genetic risk factors is technically molecular epidemiology. So this one has really kind of taken off since the sequencing of the human genome, and we can really basically like sequence a lot of people's genome, and it lets us take a group of people that have and don't have the disease and basically just scan and see if there's like a common genetic difference between the two. Another one is just toxins in the environment that basically manipulate or mess with human biochemistry. Cancer epidemiology is just because cancer is such a big topic and an important topic, it's essentially its own branch of epidemiology. Ways you can apply epidemiology to cancer is looking at risk factors for various types of cancer, looking at things that influence how long you live once you already have cancer, cancer treatments, like comparing the long-term survival depending on the treatment you got, looking at the impact of cancer screening, and lastly, just cancer in the healthcare system. Like I have a friend who, like his whole thing is looking at basically wait times in cancer and seeing if like there's systematic reasons that some people have their treatment delayed. Clinical epidemiology is looking at determinants and effects of clinical decisions. So that's going to be what my project is going to be on, and like this is basically what I'm doing, which surgery leads to a longer survival. It's also looking at the effectiveness of diagnostics and screening. the effectiveness of therapies, as well as like the policy and economics of delivering healthcare. So basically, it is epidemiology of the hospital and the healthcare system in a clinical setting, basically. Psychiatric epidemiology is looking at the etiology and progression of mental disorders. So there's an increasing involvement of genetics in this, where we're finding genetic predispositions to a lot of psychiatric disorders that we're kind of like anecdotally sure before, that like certain things like bipolar really run in families, and schizophrenia definitely has a genetic basis. But we're finding, like, well, not me, but I think in general they're finding a lot of just gene by environment things that can lead to psychiatric disorders. Some examples are like social disparities in mental health, so is socioeconomic status related to it, and is that a function of like how they interact with the healthcare system that might not be getting the help they need. Genetic predisposition to mental health, and things like drug use and mental health. A related concept is social epidemiology, except, before, like, obviously, like, psychiatric disorders are both a biological and social thing. With social epidemiology, it's more looking at how social factors influence health. So it combines a lot of scientific and social science fields. It's an example would be like socially facilitated health behaviors. So like I guess like social structure and willingness to like engage in athletic things. I guess that could be like that could be something. Also, drug use is a very social thing. It's like a socially facilitated exposure, and interaction with the healthcare system encompasses social epidemiology as well a bit. Infectious disease epidemiology, it's basically looking at why infections emerge and spread. It's usually preventative and surveillance based, in the sense that like, we're not always as concerned with infectious disease about what's causing it, because what's causing it is pretty self-explanatory. It's just exposure to the agent. It's more about trying to modify like the behaviors that facilitate transmission. So things like, if we're looking at HIV, obviously we know it's causing HIV. It's the HIV virus, but this would be more about prevention through understanding the situations that permit it to be transferred. So, like trying to reduce the amount of like unprotected sex and needle sharing that's happening. And you can see just by the way I'm describing all these, they're all kind of they all share a lot with each other, and it's kind of splitting hairs sometimes. They're like, I imagine that a lot of people would see some of these fields as very similar. Some examples are like what precipitated this outbreak, what social factors are facilitating transmission, and what's the reason that some people are and aren't contracting the disease given a similar amount of exposure. So basically Zoonotic epidemiology is something that especially interests me. I'm hoping to someday do some work on that. It's looking at diseases transfer between humans and animals, specifically like spillover events. So events when a disease that was previously like only, let's say, a bat disease, and then a bat and a pig encounter each other, and the bat gets the pig sick, and then the pig gets a human sick, but the bat would not have been able to directly infect a human. That's kind of a common story with zoonoses, where something wasn't capable of infecting a human. Like a human and a bat have too dissimilar of a physiology to share a disease. But pigs often represent like a melting pot and an amplification factor for various diseases, trading information to the point that in the biology of a pig kind of rubs itself off on the virus, in the sense that like some viruses that us and pigs share mix with the virus that the pig and the bat share, and they trade some of their like surface proteins, and all of a sudden there's some additional virus that permits this disease in a bat to spill over to us. And I don't know the full gist of it, but I think spillover from bats has something to do with COVID. So risky behaviors like wet markets are an ideal place for zoonotic epidemiologists to try and make a difference. I already spent too much time with this one. If you're interested in what a wet market is, you can just look it up. Investigating outbreaks is another big one, and identifying the potential for spillover. There's a lot of like doomsday in zoonotic epidemiology, where Like there's certain bird flus that it's just a matter of when it's going to spill over, and then we just got to deal with that when it comes. Agricultural epidemiology is what I did my master's in. It's basically looking at the health and productivity of farm animals. Some examples of what they would ask about are like, why are cows getting mastitis, and is it related to milk production? Is that causing it, or is mastitis going to limit milk production? Basically, it's like a combination of trying to minimize disease and maximize production. And production is like how much meat they put on, or how much milk they're producing, how many eggs they're laying, stuff like that. Also, conception rate, because in order to produce milk, cows need to get pregnant, so we're trying to make sure they're getting pregnant as frequently as possible. So agricultural epidemiology, although it focuses on disease, it has different priorities than regular epidemiology, but they often have human analogs where, like, we have reproductive epidemiology for humans. So in that way, an agricultural epidemiologist is neat because they would cover a lot of those other branches that are separate in the human world, but basically they all get combined into one person for an agricultural setting. Food safety is another big one. So certain diseases that might be able to like stay with the animal through the like the process that goes from farm to grocery store. Some diseases might be able to survive that, and also just like things that aren't biotic, things like chemical residues from medications the animal had could stay in the body, and all that encompasses what an agricultural epidemiologist is interested in. Nutritional epidemiology is comparatively new, I think. It's looking at food as a cause and prevention of disease. So obesity is kind of part of that, because that's a growing problem that's related to nutrition. It's a very social thing as well. Nutritional deficiencies, it's not as big a deal in the West, but it's a big deal internationally at various places for various reasons. Also, like adequate nutrition as a promoter of human life, I guess. And that's like kind of like what I was talking about with agriculture, where like the human form of productivity, basically, like just living a healthier life based on having a higher plane and a more quality plane of nutrition. Pharmacoepidemiology is pretty neat. So basically, like the clinical trials it takes for a drug to go from being researched to on the shelf is kind of scary short. How like little they. So basically, like they'll follow them for a few years usually, but by the time it's getting on the shelves, the people who were first given it ever, like from that point when like the first person is given the first pill in its first stage of study, by the time it's being consumed by everyone else, that person, it still will have only been like a decade maybe since they took the pill. So meanwhile we're giving it to people, and we don't know what the pill's going to do if you take it for like 20 years, because they didn't do studies that long by the time it got on the shelves. So pharmacoepidemiology is great. I just watched a series called Dope Sick that was really good, just because it talked about Purdue Pharma and them getting OxyContin on the shelf, and basically epidemiology came up as basically looking at the long-term effects of OxyContin, and those are things that there's not really any reason, like there's no financial interest for these pharmaceutical companies to look at the long-term effects, because they basically already achieved their goal. They've gotten it on the shelf, they've gotten it through the FDA, but it's kind of up to other people to see if there's really long-term consequences, and to basically hold them accountable and have them modify the drug or take it off the shelves if there's some long-term side effects. So example, like what are the long-term side effects of a drug? Are people taking it as prescribed, or like with OxyContin, is it being used inappropriately, and then it represents both a useful medicine in one setting but also a very abusable drug in another setting, and comparing which drug is more effective over time. Reproductive epi is fertility and infertility in both males and females. It's also health during pregnancy, so health of the mother and the fetus throughout pregnancy, and it includes young children often. Usually, like is something the mother is exposed to during pregnancy. Does it have like long-term effects on the child's development? Some examples are like, is exposure to something causing infertility, is something harmful during a pregnancy, and like I said, basically pregnancy exposures and child development. The last one is geriatric epidemiology, so it's looking at the health of elderly people. diseases specific to older people, and also contributions to aging. I think aging might be its own specific thing, but basically, it's also, I conceptually would group it with geriatric epidemiology. So some examples of what a geriatric epidemiologist might be interested in is like, is this therapy or surgery that was just developed also suitable for elderly populations? Because whatever initial clinical epi test would probably, this would probably be an underrepresented demographic in those studies. Neurodegenerative diseases, again, could probably be their own discipline, but it typically occurs to older people, so I would group it with geriatric epidemiology. And yeah, no, so there's a lot of branches of epidemiology, and there's probably even more than I just described. Um, but yeah, no, I hope you found that interesting.